Well, our next panelist is Professor Amotz Zahavi. I cannot refrain from quoting something that was written about him, about his book, when he published the book together with Professor Avishag Zahavi in 1997. One of the reviewers wrote, "In the space of 2 decades, the handicap principle has gone from dismissed, laughable nonsense to being the central explanation underlying all forms of animal communication." That's magnificent, isn't it? In one single sentence, someone has formulated the possibility of a renegade theory, another renegade theory, to become a central one. And everybody knows who Amotz Zahavi is. If someone here doesn't know, I'm not going to use the shaming techniques that have been used recently. Please, go ahead. You don't need any PowerPoint.
No.
You speak in a natural way.
Well, I try to.
Yes.
Over the last 20, 30 years, I developed the theory of signal selection. The mechanism by which signal selection is the handicap principle. But I found out recently that it is much more general theory than I expected, because I found it also about signaling inside the body in hormones and neurotransmitters. They follow the same logic of the handicap principle. And I know very little about culture, but I see some similarities. But first I want to explain in what way the theory of signal selection is a fundamental theory about selection. People usually say there is natural selection and sexual selection. Darwin's idea about sexual selection is vague. That was why many people didn't accept it, because it put in together signals and material things. But fighting for sex is no different from fighting for food. So he didn't have to include it in another way. But he also missed the point that signaling for sex has the same problem as signaling for all other kinds of communication. So really the dividing line in natural selection is signal selection on the one hand and all other characters on the other hand. What is the main fundamental difference? In non-signaling traits, if, for instance, you learn to build a house from a certain material which is the best, you don't mind that everybody else is doing the same thing. You will still do that. But in signaling, if everybody can signal alike, the signal has no value. It is inflated. Take like the inflation of money. If everybody has money, which is a signal of wealth, money loses its function. But iron for building a house will still continue whether everybody uses it. You don't mind that you still benefit. So this distinction is fundamental, basic mechanism of the two lines of selection. Signal selection on the one hand and all the rest on the other hand. And there are many examples of how a signal is lost if everybody can do the same thing. For instance, ducks advertise that they do not mind predators by showing off by colors. But the same species, the mallard, has gone into several islands where there are no predators. So there is no point to walk around in Tel Aviv and say, I'm not afraid of lions. So they lost their colors. There is no point to put colors. And there are several other things I don't have the time to repeat. Those who want to see more of these things, everything is mostly in the book I wrote with my wife. Now, what is the difference? Perhaps I want to say one essential thing about the handicap principle, which is missed by people. The handicap principle is asking the signaler to invest in showing that the information is reliable. That means that the signal itself tests the reliability of the information. So the handicap principle is a test. Now, usually people study a signal and they say, well, one said something and the other went away, so he was threatened. But perhaps he went away because he was not interested in courtship of the other. Or perhaps the other smelled bad. You see some talking, but you don't know why the other one went out. But a test of English is different from a test of Hebrew. If you look on the kind of the test, you are able to know what more about what, or guess what is the message in the signal. Because you simply look at the properties of the test and you have a clue to the information that is delivered. Now there is, the reason I am starting with this is because I found out that many of the things that I'm talking about signaling has parallels in culture. Like the first people who went to Africa came back with shields and spears and other things to show off. But once everybody has been in Africa, they stopped doing it. There was inflation in that show-off. The same thing about many other cultural things that we are putting them in the book. So I believe that culture can be also divided into two distinct parallels like signal selection and material and all other traits. We can say material culture, that is the way to handle things that benefit you directly, knowing how to prepare food, how to find food. These are physical things. And all the others like music, like playing with football, like some things which do not give you material benefit directly. Where in a way, it is an investment in non-rewarding physical things. And I want to say two things. The implications of the idea of signal selection has wide implications on many things like altruism, on kin selection, on the relationship of the pattern of the signal to the message in it, but I won't talk about it. I just will concentrate on two things. One is doubtful because I started thinking about it only about a month ago. We found out when studying why particular chemical signals have been selected to function in many animals over millions and millions of years. It is the same chemical signal, so there must be something good in it. And we found out that all of them are noxious chemicals. They started from more noxious chemicals. You could find out many other simpler chemicals that are not so noxious, but still as if signal selection in the body looked for noxious chemical as a starting point of signaling. And then I remembered in my studies of the birds that if you want to take, because in communication you need a receiver, how can you make the receiver being attentive to you? He may not. He is attentive to other things. So you give him presents that benefit him. He may take part of it or not. But if you do him something bad, he has to counter and pay attention to the something bad. You know, boys pull the hair of girls to attract their attention. Children like stories. Many of the customary stories that you read to children are not good, nice stories about somebody who was fine and good and had children. And there must be something bad in the story that will be overcome or not, but there is a bad component. So I believe that I didn't follow that idea. It is a very new one, and I'm not going to study culture. But perhaps the not physical culture, if one looked back how it started, a certain branch of culture which is not physical, how it started and why people started to take that particular model of transmitting certain things. Why? Well, this is a kind of, I'm not sure all my colleagues will agree with me, but I think people who are dealing with non-physical culture, what is the adaptive significance of it? What motivates them to do it? They simply want to say, I am the best in my field. Like football players, I want to be the best in football player. I want to be the best in communication. Somebody else wants to be the best. This is the driving thing that I believe motivates people to do and proceed and invest their time in something which does not give them any practical benefit except prestige, which is very important thing, and it is the essential thing in all of these things. So that was one thing I wanted to direct the attention of people who look on culture. Try to see the importance of bad things and good things as the starting point of a certain particular communication system. And the other thing is more important, and so I shall devote my time more to it, is the interaction between the physical culture, where somebody invent the use of iron or the use of a particular food to use fire to make food better for digestion. This is in a non-signaling part. But what is the interaction? The handicap principle suggests that in order to show off how good you are in the physical things, what is your physical quality, you have to decrease it and say, in spite of the difficulty of doing what I am doing under these conditions, I am still better than somebody who is in a more optimal situation. Like carrying a longer tail than needed for steering, like having the big antlers and so on. So it reduces the efficiency, and still I am better than you are without it. So winning with a handicap is a better win and give you better prestige than winning without a handicap. And now there is a big question, how culture goes from material culture, goes from one thing, one direction to another, because you need many mutations. If I take the analog in biology, how came that scales of lizards developed into feathers? You need a whole series of mutations until you develop an efficient feather from a scale. And if you don't believe in macro mutations and all these kind of things, I believe that everything should be explained by very simple, slow mutations, just one mutation which make a little change and another. So this is a very fundamental question. But if, or perhaps I will do it with horns, that it will be more easier to say. It is important for people how people have evolved horns on their head. I mean, how animals evolved horns on their head. It takes a lot of development, and until the horn is a horn, if all these mutations didn't accumulate, and how did they accumulate in order to make an efficient horn? So it is in the following way. If it is important to show that I am watching somebody for communication, because people who watch others are showing their interest in the others, whether they are threatening him or courting him. Now, from a distance, it's not easy to show where you look. But if you have two protrusions, little ones, above your eyes, just protrusions. Birds do it by feathers, and some animals do it, but they are still doing it, some of the small ungulates in Africa have this, they are not yet used for fighting. They are just helping the observer to see where the onlooker is looking. So first, the horns started exactly here and not here in other places because they were showing the direction of the gaze. They were for communication. And they were handicaps because somebody with these little horns cannot butt at his opponent as some non-horn animal ungulates do. Then it grew, and then only there was the final thing was a mutation that hardened them in order to fight. And then came back so this is how horns were developed, slowly by mutations that helped communication and was later used in a direction of physical advantage. In the same way, this kind of interaction, I took the example of Kennedy, the late Kennedy president in the United States, when if at that time he, as if it is a story that I invented, if he would have come then to the Congress and say, we are the best country with the best technology in the world, let us invest $2 billion in developing the technology of the 21st century. Nobody would have given him because they say, to whom do we give it? To what kind of institute? For what kind of target we shall put in? But when he came and said, let us be the first people on, as a show-off, the first people on the moon, they had to invent the technology of materials, the technology of communication, and many things which were the basis of the physical technologies of the culture of the 21st century. You couldn't have given a direction for development what it will be, but the handicaps that the show-off business on some things may come to a place from which a new technology can go up in another direction. And since the handicap is taking it in a very direct direction toward to make the ability to move less good and still you win, all the mutations accumulate on the same line until they come, oh, I can use that for, at first the scales of the lizards developed with many protrusions and more fascinated protrusions to show off. And then you got the primitive feather which could be used for flight. And so the interaction between the two things is solve the way by which one direction, physical direction of culture, can suddenly go arrive to a starting point in another direction. And I think this is like other things in the theory of signal selection, which is described in the only book we have ever written. There are many other things. Perhaps I shall end up with saying something, what is the advantage of universities? You know, Spence got his Nobel Prize in, I think it was 2003, he didn't use the word, but he said because it had forced a student to show off his ability to learn something so that his future boss will not have to test him and spend the time. Because if he knew exactly where he is going, he could learn everything he needed without the university within half a year or a year being apprentice to somebody. But the university is a big handicap on the students to come with a test of the paper that they have to show their abilities. The university do not necessarily help them. And you can look on all the art classes in a university as the kind of a waste that the physical world is wasting, but many of the things which started as a show-off of somebody's ability to deal with spiritual things like art and theater and so on, were later used in the physical world, and the physical world would not have used them unless they were developed in the department of art. For instance, when the people who looked on how the atom is built, it could have been a waste of time. And many things that are in the universities, theoretical things, you don't see at all how they will come into use. But unfortunately, the use of the understanding the atom led to the atomic bomb. Nobody thought to start investigating the atom, and nobody who started to investigate the atom was sure that he will end up with understanding it. So it is a kind of waste. It is a kind of handicap on the treasury. And my daughter pointed to me that many of the machines that were used during the Middle Ages, sorry, I forgot to, somebody wants to criticize my ideas. And that many of the machines were developed for the use in the theater to move things. And only later they were used as for the physical things. Like many things in mathematics are now very important tools in the physical world and so on. So the interaction between the west side and the east side of the university, the material world and the theoretical world, is, I believe, that it is a parallel of the signal selection and the selection of all other things but signals. And this is, to me, my finding it, and I didn't have time to it, the same principles inside the body where all the cells are genetically related, and there is no reason, as people say, to use handicaps in people who are related to one another, because relatives should believe in one another. Mothers should believe in their sons, and sons never will kill their mothers, and so on. And anyhow, even in the body where all the cells are related, they are using handicaps to make sure that there are no mistakes in the communication. Because a mistake from a friend may be as disastrous as a cheating. So whenever you get information from somebody and not from your own direct observation, you had better check it, whether it comes from your enemy or from your friend, unless it is reliable, so it may do you wrong. So the handicap principle is a general feature of the selection of signals, and I believe I am not going to study it in cultural situations, but I believe that people who study culture should pay attention to the parallel between signal selection and material selection, and same thing about physical culture, and show off by non-physical culture. And thank you for your attention.